The neighborhood was supposed to be peaceful, a place where families could enjoy the calm of tree-lined streets, children playing on sidewalks, and the steady hum of lawnmowers on warm weekends. That was the promise when the homeowners first bought their homes, a community maintained by rules. Yes, but also by a sense of order and respect. But beneath the surface of this picturesque community, tensions simmered. The HOA board, a group meant to protect property values, had slowly grown into something much more invasive. They had earned a reputation for nitpicking every detail, from mailbox colors to the length of holiday decorations, to the exact shade of blinds visible through windows. And though the neighbors complained in hushed tones, no one dared to challenge them directly. It was into this environment that a simple letter arrived, a folded piece of paper, slipped into an envelope with the HOAS emblem embossed at the top. On the surface, it looked routine, like the usual updates or meeting reminders that came every month. But the words inside carried a weight that was anything but ordinary. The letter accused the homeowner of violating community landscaping rules. It claimed the grass was not up to community standards and the hedges were untrimmed and unkempt. It listed potential fines, escalating amounts that could, if unpaid, eventually lead to liens against the property itself. The irony was glaring. The homeowner's yard was the pride of the street, lush green, carefully maintained and admired by nearly everyone who walked past. The flower beds were full of seasonal blooms. The lawn was thick and even the hedges were neatly squared. To the average passerby, it was a showcase of care and effort. And yet, here it was in writing, a threat, signed off by the HOA president herself. At first, there was disbelief. Surely this was a mistake, perhaps a notice meant for another house. But as the words were read again and again, it became clear that the HOA had intentionally targeted the property. And it wasn't about grass height or hedge trimming. This was something else. Whispers from neighbors began to surface. The HOA president, known for her stern demeanor and obsession with power, had been complaining about certain residents. She had made it her mission to set an example with fines, hoping to instill fear into others who dared question her authority. And unfortunately, this family had been chosen as her target. The next few days were uneasy. Every time the homeowners stepped outside, they felt the president's eyes from across the street, watching, waiting, recording mental notes about the property. Other neighbors offered sympathetic nods, but none dared speak out publicly. They knew the risks speaking against the HOA could mean, becoming the next target. But what the president didn't know was that the family had no intention of rolling over quietly. They had kept meticulous records of their yard maintenance receipts for lawn care services, photos of the yard taken regularly, even a paper trail of communication with landscapers. And they had something even more powerful: determination. The notice may have been delivered with authority, but it had awakened something the HOA had not expected: a refusal to be bullied. Instead of paying the fine, instead of bending under pressure, the family began to gather evidence. Photos from neighbors who admired the yard, witnesses who had walked past and could testify to its condition, even timestamps from delivery services, showing the yard looking immaculate at the exact times claimed to be in violation. The HOA had made one critical mistake. They underestimated the resolve of the people they were targeting. What began as a letter meant to intimidate was about to spiral into a battle that would shake the entire community. And this was only the beginning. The days following the arrival of the HOAS violation notice were tense, but they were also filled with purpose. Instead of retreating into frustration, the family turned the sting of injustice into energy. The notice wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a challenge, and they were determined to meet it head-on. The first step was to organize everything. On the dining room table, a folder began to fill. Lawn care receipts, some dating back months, were stacked neatly. Each one bore dates and details of mowing, edging, fertilizing, and hedge trimming. Alongside the receipts were photographs, time-stamped images showing a yard that was not just maintained, but thriving. Every photo told the same story: thick grass, colorful flowers, and a hedge line as clean as any magazine cover. Neighbors, too, became part of the effort. Quietly, and often with a nervous glance toward the HOA president's house, they offered their support. Several had taken their own photos of the neighborhood, sometimes capturing the family's yard in the background. Others wrote short statements, affirming they had never once seen the yard in disarray. These contributions, while small individually, began to form a collective wall of defense. But the family knew this wasn't enough. They needed more than just proof of maintenance. They needed to dismantle the HOA's claim piece by piece. That's when the research began. Late nights were spent combing through the HOA's official documents, the very covenant rules the president wielded so confidently. Every page was read, highlighted, and annotated. It didn't take long to uncover glaring inconsistencies. The HOA's landscaping guidelines were vague, with no exact measurements for grass height or hedge dimensions. Terms like well-kept and community standard appeared repeatedly, but with no definitions or benchmarks to anchor them. This discovery was crucial. The HOA had accused them based on rules that were, at best, subjective, and subjective rules could be challenged, especially when backed by evidence. Meanwhile, the family decided to go further. They hired a professional landscaper to evaluate the property and provide an official written assessment. The landscaper's report was glowing. The yard exceeded industry standards, with healthy soil, proper irrigation, and professional-grade upkeep, signed, dated, and stamped with the company's official seal. The report was a weapon the HOA couldn't easily dismiss. Yet, as the evidence grew, so did the tension. The HOA president seemed to notice the activity. She was seen driving past slowly, phone in hand, as if recording the property. She lingered outside during yard work, muttering under her breath about violations stacking up. Rumors spread that she had already drafted a second notice, threatening an even steeper fine. The family didn't flinch. Instead, they took their preparation further. A small security camera was installed facing the yard, capturing every angle. Not only would it protect against false claims, but it would also document any suspicious behavior. And within just a few days, the camera paid off. Footage showed the HOA president herself, late at night, pacing near the property line, flashlight in hand, scrutinizing the hedges as though hunting for flaws. This was gold. Proof not only of harassment, but of an obsessive fixation. Piece by piece, the folder on the dining room table grew heavier. Receipts, photos, witness statements, professional evaluations, video footage. It was no longer just evidence. It was ammunition, and soon it would be unleashed. The family wasn't planning to stop at disproving the violation. They had bigger ambitions. They wanted to expose the HOA for what it truly was, a tool of intimidation and abuse. And they wanted to do it in a way that would leave no room for retaliation. As the next HOA board meeting loomed, the president walked around with smug confidence, certain her fine would be paid, and her authority reinforced. But across the street, in the house with the violating yard, a storm was brewing. The HOA had picked the wrong target, and soon, the entire neighborhood would see just how big of a mistake that was. The night of the HOA board meeting arrived with an unusual electricity in the air. These meetings were usually quiet affairs, filled with discussions of budgets, pool hours, and the occasional debate about mailbox repairs. But this time was different. Word had spread, whispered from porch to porch, that the family with the perfect yard was planning to challenge the HOA president's violation notice. Neighbors who normally skipped the meetings decided to attend. Folding chairs filled quickly, lining the walls of the small community clubhouse. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. The HOA board sat at a long table in the front, papers stacked neatly, microphones set up to project their voices. At the center, as always, was the president, her posture rigid, her expression carved into a look of authority. She tapped her pen on the desk with the confidence of someone who had grown used to being obeyed. The meeting began like all others, with formalities and roll calls. But soon enough, the violation notice was brought up. The president cleared her throat and, with practiced authority, announced that the homeowner in question had failed to meet community landscaping standards, and that escalating fines were pending. All eyes turned toward the family. The room grew silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. It was the kind of silence that begged for resolution. When their turn came to respond, the family didn't raise their voices. Instead, they began to unpack their folder of evidence. One by one, they laid out the documents, receipts from lawn services, Photographs of the yard taken on the exact dates cited in the violation, and statements from neighbors affirming the property had never fallen into disrepair. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. The president's face, once calm and commanding, tightened slightly. But it wasn't over. The family then presented the professional landscaper's reported detailed, signed assessment stating the yard exceeded professional standards. Gasps echoed through the room as copies were passed to the board members, who glanced nervously at one another. And then came the final blow. From a small USB drive, the family played footage from their newly installed security camera. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life, showing grainy nighttime footage of the HOA president herself creeping near the property line, flashlight in hand, inspecting the hedges in the dark. Her obsession was undeniable, caught on camera for everyone to see. The room erupted. Neighbors whispered loudly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others glaring at the president. The once feared figure now looked exposed, her authority cracking beneath the weight of the evidence. The president tried to recover, insisting that standards were standards, and that rules applied equally to everyone. But the damage was done. The evidence was irrefutable, and the board members knew it. No one wanted to be caught defending what was now clearly a baseless attack. After a hushed exchange among themselves, the board announced the violation was rescinded. No fines would be collected. The case was closed. But the victory didn't feel complete. For the family, this wasn't just about avoiding a fine. It was about standing up to a bully who had used her position to intimidate the very people she was supposed to serve. As the meeting adjourned and neighbors began to file out, conversations buzzed with a new tone. For the first time, the community saw that the HOA's power wasn't absolute. They saw that the president could be challenged and defeated. The president sat silently as the room emptied, her jaw tight, her eyes avoiding contact. She had been humiliated publicly, and though the violation was rescinded, everyone could sense that this was far from over. What no one realized yet was that the confrontation at the meeting was only the first battle. The family had won a skirmish, but the war with the HOA and with its embattled president was only beginning. Humiliation is a powerful motivator, and for the HOA president, the sting of that public meeting cut deeper than anyone realized. She had spent years cultivating control, ruling the neighborhood through intimidation and rigid enforcement of vague rules. To be exposed so openly, to have her authority dismantled in front of dozens of residents, was not something she could accept. In the days that followed, her behavior shifted. She no longer attempted friendly waves or small talk during her daily walks. Instead, she patrolled with a new intensity, her eyes sweeping over properties with a sharper edge, her notepad clutched tighter than before. The whispers from neighbors grew louder. "She's going after them," one said on the sidewalk. "Mark my words, she won't let this go." And sure enough, it didn't take long for the retaliation to begin. A second notice arrived at the family's mailbox, this one citing improper trash placement. The letter claimed their cans had been left out too long after pickup, a violation that carried a smaller fine, but was no less insulting. The family, who knew for certain their cans had been retrieved within the hour, quickly realized this was nothing more than harassment. A week later, another notice appeared, this time for improperly stored holiday decorations. The supposed violation referenced a small wreath still hanging on the front door. The absurdity was obvious, but the intent was clear. The president was determined to bury them in paper, to create constant stress until they either gave up or left the neighborhood. The family documented each new notice, filing them neatly into the growing evidence folder. They took photos of trash cans inside the garage, time-stamped images of decorations removed, even screenshots of the HOA's own vague guidelines. Each new accusation only made their case stronger, but the barrage was exhausting. Meanwhile, neighbors began to watch closely. Some expressed sympathy, offering quiet words of encouragement. Others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid to draw the president's attention. Yet there were a few who seemed to revel in the drama, whispering that maybe the family deserved it for standing up in the first place. Division was spreading, and the president thrived on it. Behind the scenes, the family made another critical move. They consulted with a lawyer, specializing in HOA disputes. The attorney was all too familiar with stories like this. Petty power struggles, baseless fines, and harassment disguised as rule enforcement. With the lawyer's guidance, the family prepared formal responses to each notice, demanding evidence and citing inconsistencies. They also began preparing for something bigger, the possibility of legal action against the HOA itself. But retaliation didn't stop at paperwork. Strange things began happening around the property. A small scratch appeared on the family's car overnight. Lawn ornaments were mysteriously knocked over. Trash that wasn't theirs showed up in their yard. While nothing could be directly proven, the timing was suspicious, and the family suspected the president or someone acting on her behalf was escalating beyond official channels. Once again, the security cameras became invaluable. Footage captured shadows lingering near the property at odd hours, though it was never clear enough to identify individuals. The mere presence of trespassers told a story. Someone was watching, someone was prowling, someone wanted them gone. The tension reached its peak when the family received an official letter threatening legal action from the HOA itself. The president had convinced the board to authorize a lawsuit, claiming the family was creating disruption and failing to comply with community standards. It was a bold move, one that shocked even longtime residents who had grown used to the president's heavy-handed tactics. But what she didn't anticipate was that her opponents were no longer just defending themselves. They were preparing to strike back. The family had meticulously built their case, gathering not only evidence of their compliance, but also proof of harassment, abuse of power, and negligence by the HOA board. They had witnesses, documents, professional reports, and hours of video footage. Most importantly, they now had a lawyer ready to expose everything in a courtroom if necessary. The president thought she was tightening the noose. Instead, she was building the rope that could hang her career, her reputation, and perhaps even her role in the community. And as the date of the first pretrial hearing loomed, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Some whispered about the possibility of the president finally being removed. Others feared what might happen if the family lost. The balance of power had shifted, but the outcome was far from certain. The HOA president had declared war. What she didn't realize was that her opponents had already prepared their counterattack, and it was far more devastating than she could imagine. The courthouse was not a place most homeowners ever expected to find themselves. But on the morning of the first pretrial hearing, the family walked through its heavy glass doors with steady determination. For weeks, they had prepared, their evidence carefully organized, their attorney sharpening every angle of their case. This wasn't just about a yard anymore. It was about standing up against abuse of power, about refusing to let intimidation rule an entire community. The HOA president arrived as well, flanked by a few board members who looked more nervous than confident. Her face, however, betrayed no doubt. She strode in with the same self-assured posture she wore at every meeting, clutching her binder of documents like a weapon. To her, this was the final step in breaking her opponents once and for all. But the courtroom was not the HOA clubhouse. Here, vague rules and subjective opinions held little weight. Judges demanded clarity, evidence, and facts. The hearing began with the HOA's attorney presenting their case. They argued that the family had repeatedly violated community standards, that their behavior had disrupted harmony, and that fines were necessary to maintain property values. But as the lawyers spoke, the argument began to sound hollow. There were no specific measurements, no clear evidence, just vague language lifted from the covenant and the president's personal notes. Then it was the family's turn. Their lawyer rose, calm and deliberate, and began to dismantle the HOA's claims piece by piece. Photographs of the yard, displayed on a screen for the court, showed a picture-perfect lawn, healthy flowers, and neatly trimmed hedges. Receipts confirmed consistent professional maintenance. The landscaper's report provided expert testimony that the property exceeded expectations. And then came the footage, grainy but unmistakable. The video showed the HOA president prowling near the property at night, flashlight in hand, scrutinizing bushes as though searching for flaws that didn't exist. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising among spectators. The judge's brow furrowed. What had been framed as a simple violation was unraveling into something much darker, an obsession, perhaps even harassment. The family's lawyer pressed further, presenting copies of every retaliatory notice the HOA had issued since the first violation was rescinded. Trash cans, wreaths, minor details inflated into threats of fines. Each notice was met with time-stamped photographs proving compliance. The pattern was clear. This wasn't enforcement. This was targeted harassment. The judge, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. He questioned the HOA's attorney directly, asking for clear definitions of the supposed violations. The lawyer hesitated, fumbling with papers, unable to provide concrete answers. The vagueness of the HOA's rules, once a powerful tool of intimidation, was now their greatest weakness. By the end of the hearing, it was clear momentum had shifted. The judge ordered a pause on all fines and violations until the case could be fully heard, and he sternly reminded the HOA of its duty to act in good faith. The family walked out of the courtroom that day not just relieved, but emboldened. They had survived the first round, and their case was stronger than ever. But outside, in the parking lot, the president lingered. Her composure had cracked. She barked at the board members who had come with her, blaming them for their lack of support. They stood silently, eyes downcast, the weight of her obsession finally becoming too heavy to ignore. For the first time, cracks appeared not just in her authority, but in the loyalty of the very board that had enabled her for so long. News of the courtroom drama spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, residents were whispering about what they'd heard. Some admired the family's courage. Others wondered how much longer the president could hold her position. The once unshakable image of her authority was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of public scrutiny. Still, the battle wasn't over. The full trial loomed ahead, and with it, the possibility of a permanent judgment against the HOA. The president wasn't finished, and her anger now burned hotter than ever. But the family wasn't finished either. Their evidence was airtight, their resolve unshakable, and the neighborhood was beginning to see the truth. What had started as a single notice about grass had evolved into something much bigger, a fight for fairness, justice, and the right to live without fear in one's own home. And as the trial approached, it was no longer just about one family. The outcome would shape the entire community. The president had tried to crush them. Instead, she had given them the stage to expose everything. The trial began under a cloud of anticipation. By now, nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood was aware of the conflict. Whispers circulated at the mailbox, in the community pool, and across backyard fences. Some had quietly taken sides, while others simply watched, eager to see what would unfold. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The HOA president sat at the plaintiff's table, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward. Yet her air of confidence had dimmed. The weeks of exposure, the humiliation of the first hearing, and the growing whispers in the community had worn her down. Even her fellow board members, once steadfast allies, now avoided her gaze. The family and their lawyers sat opposite, their stacks of evidence neatly organized. Their case wasn't built on emotion or opinion, it was built on facts, documents, and undeniable proof. And today, it would all come to light. The HOA presented its argument first, attempting to paint the family as disruptive rule breakers who resisted community standards. But their claims faltered quickly. When pressed for specifics, their lawyers stumbled. Photos presented as evidence of violations were vague or undated, while testimony from board members contradicted itself under questioning. The rules they leaned on proved hopelessly subjective, more open to interpretation than enforcement. Then came the defense. The family's lawyer rose and, with deliberate precision, began to lay out the timeline. Photos flashed on the screen: vibrant grass, manicured hedges, immaculate flower beds. Receipts and professional reports confirmed consistent maintenance. Neighbor statements corroborated the same. And then the footage returned. The image of the HOA president wandering near the property at night, with a flashlight, was played again, this time in front of the full courtroom. Gasps filled the room, followed by an uneasy silence. The scene spoke louder than any argument. This was not rule enforcement. This was obsession. The lawyer then pivoted to the pattern of retaliation: the trash cans, the wreath, the stream of notices that followed the rescinded violation. Each one was shown to be baseless, contradicted by photographic evidence. The pile of notices, once meant to intimidate, now looked like evidence of harassment. When it was over, the HOA president herself was called to the stand. Under questioning, Her composure cracked. She grew defensive, deflecting, even raising her voice as the inconsistencies in her story were exposed. When asked why she personally inspected the property at night, she had no clear answer. By the time she stepped down, her authority was shattered. The judge's ruling came swiftly. The violation notices were declared void. The HOA was ordered to cover the family's legal fees, and the board was sternly warned about overstepping its authority. More than that, the judge recommended that the HOA conduct an internal review of its leadership, citing the president's conduct as a gross misuse of power. The family walked out of the courthouse victorious. Relief washed over them. But so did something greater, vindication. They had stood up not just for themselves, but for the entire neighborhood, proving that the HOA's power was not absolute. Back in the community, the ripple effect was immediate. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke more openly. Calls for the president's resignation spread quickly, and within weeks, she stepped down under pressure, her reign of intimidation ending in disgrace. The board, eager to salvage its reputation, voted in new leadership and revised the vague rules that had caused so much strife. The family's yard, once the center of conflict, now became a symbol. People walked by and admired it not just for its beauty, but for what it represented: resilience, justice, and the refusal to be bullied. The president had set out to make an example of them. In the end, she succeeded, but not in the way she intended. Instead of fear, she inspired courage. Instead of submission, she sparked change. What began as a single notice about grass had grown into a battle that reshaped an entire community. And as life returned to normal, the family knew one thing with certainty: the HOA had made a very big mistake.